Our topic today is immigration at the turn of the 20th century. So what I mean by turn of the 20th century is the late 1800s, early 1900s. And these are kind of the dates that I've given for what this lecture kind of covers. Actually, let me change that. We'll go 1880s. Oh gosh, look at that. All right. So, we're going to skip that. So we've got to compare this new wave of immigration to the old immigration. So what I've highlighted in blue and added onto here is old immigration at the top of your note set. And old immigration was before the Civil War and during the Civil War. 10 million people coming to the United States, mostly from Northern and Western Europe. So countries like Germany or Ireland. Many of them came over here due to famine in their old countries, and many of them were well educated if they were from Germany, or spoke English if they were from Ireland. And then on the West Coast, we had a lot of immigration, people hunting jobs, building railroads, and the gold rush in California and all those mining towns. A lot of Chinese and Asian immigrants came over for those jobs. Now, what we're talking about today is what I've highlighted in green and put a star on, is new immigration from 1880 to the 1910s or 1920s. And this is an even larger wave of immigrants coming over, 18 million, from a different part of Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe. And I gave you some examples: Greece, Italy, Poland, Russia, some of the Slovakias over there. And these immigrants, for the most part, were not educated and did not speak English. So they were different in that way than the previous wave of immigration. They also brought over a host of new religions like Eastern Orthodox or other forms of Judaism. They were Jewish. And many Catholics also came over. So not only do they not speak English, but they had different religion as well, which kind of set them apart and made them a little bit more different. In fact, by 1910, 1 in every 7 Americans was foreign born, meaning that our nation was a nation of immigrants, especially in the urban cities. So we're going to talk about push factors and pull factors that brought immigrants over to America. When I say push factor, it means something bad was happening in their country that pushed them out. Political issues, famine, starvation, drought. When I say pull factor, I mean something is good in our country that pulls them in. And I wrote the word opportunity. So job opportunities or food opportunities or opportunities to move up in society or own land. So let's talk about push factors first. That's this bullet. Many were pushed out of Europe for persecution reasons. Their religions were not accepted in Europe. Jews were persecuted long before the Holocaust, and that's called anti-Semitism. And Semitism meant that people were against Jews, and that had happened in Russia. They were being gathered up and executed, and so many of them fled to America, where we preach freedom of religion. Maybe others in Southern Europe left because of famine, extreme poverty, no jobs, little economic opportunity to move up in the world, and so they wanted to come to America. Now, pull factors would be the idea that America has land, has opportunity, in search of a better life. Railroad factories, mills, mines, and railroads advertised in these countries, in their language, in the newspaper, come to America, we have jobs. So here's Ellis Island as it was during this time period, the late 1800s, and here it is nowadays. And you can go visit Ellis Island. There is a museum there. So what is Ellis Island? And there's the Statue of Liberty right next to it. So let's zoom on through here and find what was Ellis Island. Ellis Island is an immigration, I did not mean to do that, an immigration station on the east coast of America. It's in New York City. It opened in 1892, and it closed to immigrants coming in the late 1920s. And it closed down for a while, and then it was turned into a museum. Well, a few other things, but then a museum. And so back then, people would come over via boat. That was the only method of travel on passenger liners. So kind of think of like the Titanic, where it's kind of a cruise ship, but really for the poorer classes, the third and second class passengers, it was more just a mode of transportation. So the first class passengers, the rich people that bought expensive tickets and were on the top of the boat, and it felt like a cruise, it was like a vacation over to America. Those people, for the most part, did not have to go through immigration stations to come into America. They did not have to go through Ellis Island. It was the second and third class passengers who had to pass through the station. And as you come into Ellis Island, the immigrants immigrants would be medically checked on what's called the 6-second examination. And the 6-second examination was these doctors claimed that within 6 seconds they could look at how you walk and talk and look at your eyes and nose and ears and mouth and determine if you had any major sickness that could be spread, or if they were what they deemed to be mentally deficient, which is a mean term we don't use nowadays. They were specifically looking for trachoma, which means pink eye. Pink eye was not curable back then. They didn't have the penicillin and antibiotics that we have today that make pink eye a silly disease that we can get rid of in a few days. But it was easily spread and caused a lot of health complications. So if they didn't pass the medical screening, they were told to get back on the liner, get back on the boat, and basically go back to where they came from. They were not allowed to come into America. If they passed the medical examination, they would then go to a screening process, sometimes called a legal screening. And at this legal screening, they would be asked a series of rapid-fire questions, usually in their language, via an interpreter, about who they were and why they were coming here. So, who are you? What was your previous employment? How much money do you have? Where are you going to live? Do you have someone here that can vouch for you? What did you do in your old country? What was your life like in your old country? Were you ever convicted of a crime? Are you a felon? Did you ever serve time in jail? Questions like that, very rapid fire, to kind of get a feel of who these people were. But imagine you're an immigrant. This is extremely frightening, coming into this new grand hall. It was called the registrar's room, or the registration room. Doctors were poking at you, looking at you, marking on your clothes, like H for heart, X for if they deemed that you had a mental illness. And then people are asking you all these rapid fire questions. If you didn't pass any of these examinations, you would be detained in a room that looked like this, where they would either further examine you, send you to a hospital that was on Ellis Island, or send you to a legal screening board where they would dive down into your background a little bit more, kind of like a modern day background check. Okay? If you were deemed ready to go in, then you would be let go, and basically they put you on a street in the middle of New York City and said, there you go. And you had to find your way around. Now, most immigrants had family or friends or acquaintances that had immigrated before and could go to them first, find a place to live if they hadn't set that up already, and get going there. Sometimes settlement houses would accept these immigrants, but for the most part, they ended up living in crowded tenements, which we've talked about tenements before. It means it's a rundown, crowded apartment that multiple families would be living in one small area. Your whole family would be living in one room. They didn't have toilets. They usually had a latrine or like an outhouse in the basement or out back. They didn't have running water. They usually didn't have electricity or light bulbs. Some of them didn't even have windows for ventilation. For the most part, these immigrants would try and live in what we call ethnic enclaves, neighborhoods where people like them lived, small communities within these big cities where all of the Italian immigrants live together and they speak their language, eat their food, practice their religion and their tradition and holidays. So an example of that is Little Italy in New York, Chinatown in New York, or Little Tokyo in San Francisco. And these immigrants, for the most part, got unskilled labor jobs, factory jobs, farmhand jobs, mining jobs, and mill jobs. Hazardous, working all day or all night if they were on night shift in these big cities. Some of them moved out to the country and worked as farmhands, which was also like an all-day, 7 days a week sort of job. A reminder, this little picture is a reminder that these children, for the most part, did not go to school. They stayed home with their parents, their mom possibly, maybe she was a seamstress, did sewing work and worked with her, or sometimes children were sent to work in factories too. Everyone in the family worked in these poor immigrant families to try and make ends meet. So there was a lot of backlash against immigrants. A group of people deemed themselves nativists, and their thought was that they favor the interest of native-born people in America over immigrants. So basically people who took on this idea of, I was born in America, so I'm better. Which is ironic if you think about it, because America is a nation of immigrants. Only Native Americans can claim that they are native to America. But these people were white people who were saying, I was born here, so I'm better. And they discriminate against the incoming immigrants. They saw immigrants as a threat. They think that immigrants took their jobs. They blamed them for the rise of crime in cities. But in fact, that's a myth, and that's a myth to this day, because immigrants back then and now don't take the jobs that mostly Americans who were born in America want or need. Immigrants often then and now received low-skilled, low-wage jobs that no one else wanted to take. And that's because at this time, bosses and managers didn't have to pay immigrants as much as they had to pay native-born white Americans. Nativists pushed for literacy tests in order to vote and get jobs. So they wanted these people to learn how to read and write English in order to assimilate better into American culture. And they didn't want them to be speaking their native language. And this is a process called Americanization. And I wrote out the definition here, and I want you to write it too. It's social pressure for immigrants, or Native Americans really, to abandon their culture and adopt white culture. So Americanization and assimilation, which is a word we learned earlier when we were talking about Native Americans and the Indian boarding schools, are kind of similar, but there's this push for don't be like you need to be like us sort of attitude, okay? So they faced a lot of backlash in that way. And it wasn't just on the East Coast, it was also on the West Coast. So on the West Coast in San Francisco, there was an immigration station called Angel Island, and it was just like Ellis Island on the East Coast, but it was just for the West Coast. Same thing, medical screening check, legal screening, background check sort of thing. If you don't pass it, you have to go back home. But on that coast, they're getting a lot of Chinese and Japanese immigrants. There's the same backlash against immigrants on the West Coast as there was in the East Coast. There were nativists who thought that they were less than because they weren't born here, they had immigrated. California had segregation laws against Chinese people, saying they could only live in certain parts of town. San Francisco had segregation laws when it came to schools, where Japanese children had to go to different schools than white children. And it got so bad to the point that white legislatures in California, all over the country passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in Washington, D.C. that barred all Chinese immigration for 10 years. So Chinese people could not come over to America unless they had certain qualifications, and the Chinese citizens living here, Chinese immigrants living here, could not become citizens. This was finally repealed about 20 years after, but it still shows that there was major backlash against Native Americans, and that's the response they got.